Good morning, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and welcome to week 2 of Bookish Breakfast. So it's Thursday morning again, same as last week, and I thought it would be nice to try and make this into some kind of routine, is the idea. So Bookish Breakfast is when I just have my morning cup of tea and talk to you about bookish things that have happened during the week. And today I'm going into work, so it's just after 6 o'clock. So I'm going to talk to you for maybe like 10 or 15 minutes, hopefully, and then go and catch the bus. Hopefully. So what have I been doing in the last week? I was starting nights the night of the last morning of Bookish Breakfast, if that makes any sense. So I worked 4 night shifts in between. So in and around and between those nights, I managed to finally finish The Lightless Sky by Gulwali Passarlay. So The Lightless Sky is a memoir, I suppose, of Gulwali's journey from rural Afghanistan / areas of town in Afghanistan basically, to the UK, and it covers his travels through Iran, Turkey, Bulgaria, Greece, Italy, France, and finally England. And one of the interesting parts of the book actually was about the ending part when he's adapting to his life in the UK. So I think I mentioned last week about how his culture as a young boy affected his kind of views on gender. And there's a lot as he goes through the journey of like how he then starts to see different cultural perspectives. Starts to see women out and about more, starts to see women with their hair uncovered and how this kind of affects him at certain points. But by the time he gets to the UK, he's totally used to that. Like, he's been through Europe, he knows that women can wander around the streets, and that's fine. But then he gets fostered, and his foster family, obviously, they're a married couple, where the man does all the cooking, and he really struggles to adapt to that idea that a man would choose to do the cooking when he has a wife who could cook for him. And his foster dad has to like sit him down and explain to him that like marriage is a partnership. So it's interesting to see that kind of transition that he makes towards what you could call Western values, I suppose, and how like his journey contributes to that. But like, because me in my head, I'd kind of assumed that as he got used to seeing women out and about, that would go with changing other parts of his views on the position of women, when obviously it wouldn't, because he was only ever seeing women out and about. He was never really living with them or interacting with them in any way other than like seeing them on the street or having them kind of like being maybe like a humanitarian worker. So I found that interesting. The other thing that I found really, I found the whole book fascinating. But the other thing that I found really interesting was when he talks about being in Calais and the way that Calais fits into the rest of the trail that he is on, and the way that sort of traffickers and smugglers work across Iran, Turkey, and mainland Europe, versus what happens when you get to Calais, which is quite a different situation in terms of the way that the trafficking agents act. And that really relates to things that I've seen but not really understood while I've been working in Calais. So I felt like I learned a huge amount from this book that is going to probably not change the way that I act, but change the way that I understand the way that I act when I'm in Calais doing the first aid work. So I'm really glad I read this. So this was actually a recommendation. I looked back to see who recommended it, and of course it was the wonderful Jo Smith, who gave me quite a few recommendations, and this is the second one that she recommended that I read. The other one was the Year of the Runaways. So that was a great book. The one thing, I suppose, you don't really expect great writing from a memoir, particularly not. So he must have been, I think he's about my age. He was born in the same year as me, and I think he wrote this just when he started uni with the help of somebody called Nadene Ghouri. I felt like it's really hard to criticize something that is so like personal and rich and involved. But they made this decision to take out the most stressful moment of his journey, which was when he was on a boat crossing from Turkey to Greece, and they took that out and put it at the beginning as like this really dramatic start. And for me, coming into that at the beginning of the book, that was just quite overdone. But then when you got to that point in the book and that section of writing had been taken out to put into the prologue, then you lost a lot of the tension at that moment in time. And it was just like, oh, we got onto this boat and we arrived. And obviously I knew that that wasn't the case because I'd read the prologue, but it just didn't quite work. It really badly affected the rhythm of the book. And I think that they just wanted like some kind of grabbing prologue to make people read it and be like, oh my God, this is so awful. As opposed to thinking about how the story would be best told, not how the story would be best sold. But that's maybe my personal views. So I finished that on nights. And then I tried to pick up Light in August again. There's very specific kinds of books that you can read when you're working night shifts, and specific kinds of books that you cannot read. The Iliad you cannot read while working night shifts, so I cannot read. The Lightless Sky you can read. Light in August, definitely not. The complexity of the writing is one of the big strengths of Light in August, but not when you are physically and mentally exhausted. I just got quite impatient with it and felt like I had no idea what was going on, so I put that one down again. However, surprisingly, one book that you can read on night shifts is Humanitarian Negotiations Revealed, the MSF Experience. This is edited by Magone, Neuman and Weissman, although I feel like it's not the kind of book where you're kind of like thinking, oh, I wonder if that's by an author that I've heard of. So on nights you get like a little break in the middle of the night, where some people try and kind of rest. I'm not good at resting because then I can't really get started again. So I quite often do some kind of study, like an online course or something. But I just started making some notes on the things that are in this book. Oh wow, I pulled that out and now I've lost my page. So it's got some case studies, and the first case study is on the situation in Sri Lanka in the Civil War, at the last couple of years of the Civil War. And that was really, really fascinating because I know next to nothing about Sri Lanka. And this is talking about how MSF was like negotiating and like the administrative hurdles that they faced to try to get to areas where people were injured and to try to set up hospitals, and also like the kind of discomforting feeling of like when they were setting up a hospital and not many patients were making it through to them when they knew that there were a lot of people needing treatment, that like, is there some kind of vetting process going on where only certain patients are being able to reach the hospital, and like various questions like that. Previously, the only thing I think I've really heard about the Sri Lankan Civil War, because I was a little bit too young to be very like politically aware at the point when it was going on, is there is a relatively new booktuber called Samuel Duram, and in his booktube newbie tag he talked about his experience growing up in Sri Lanka. So it was really interesting to hear that. He does a lot of things, I think, about the Booker Prize, which is something that I'm not very interested in, so I haven't watched a huge number of his videos, but definitely his booktube newbie tag was fascinating. I think he's also like a poet or a playwright, so somebody to check out if you are interested in that kind of thing. Then, moving on from that, I was also reading at home a little bit more of National Geographic. So I've got up to a really interesting article on paleogenetics. I'm just going to see if I can find out who it's by. So it's like about, where is it? Andrew Curry, photographs by Remi Benali. It's about how, like, looking at the genes found in bones, like prehistoric bones of Neolithic farmers, etc., they can find out where those groups originated from. And it's interesting because they put it into this article about migration, and they are kind of using it to talk, like, in a political sense about migration. And there's a bit where it says, anyone who harkens back to racial purity is confronted with the meaninglessness of the concept. Which is very obviously, like, it is a meaningless concept, but I don't think that it has taken until paleogenetics to prove that. So it's like our good friend, was it Mr. Farage, was saying, that people are sick of experts, and if you are somebody who is clinging to the notion of racial purity, I don't think it's going to be something at the front line of science that is going to persuade you that you are wrong. I don't know, I might be wrong about that, but I feel like that's kind of wishful thinking, that you'll be able to just say, ha, look, Neolithic farmers had like varied heritages, and people will be like, oh yeah, sure, yeah, I completely am no longer a racist. I don't think that that's going to happen, but it's still a really, really interesting article from like a scientific perspective. This is a really cool little diagram that it's got, showing like the proportions of different backgrounds that kind of came out at different times. You can't really appreciate how nice it is unless you have the magazine. But anyway, really enjoying having that. Then, so I finished Nights, and the Monday, when I'd finished the Nights, sorry, my boyfriend's alarm is going off and it's quite distracting. So it stopped, thankfully. So the Monday when I finished Nights, I couldn't sleep. We had an electrician come around to do a quote, and then I just couldn't settle down. So I watched some adaptations. I watched some Agatha Christie's, which is something that I quite often do when I am just kind of done with things. So I watched some Poirot's. I watched After the Funeral, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And they're all ones I kind of only these days I try to only watch ones that I've actually read. So After the Funeral used to be one of my favourite Poirot's, actually, but now that I've had a lot of other experience with Christie, I kind of see that it's based on this trope that she really overused, which was the idea that people don't really look at women, like particularly if they're wearing interesting clothing, they only look at the clothes and they don't look at the woman. And the first time I read that, like the twist of it, and I was like, oh wow, this is amazing, this is such a good idea. And then the second time I was like, I recognise that. And then since then it's become a little bit like, I just don't quite believe it. Like, we've all had those moments when, like, I work in a uniform, and when I see my colleagues out of work, I have this moment when I'm like, oh my God, I didn't recognise you. But I do recognise them, like, 2 seconds later. And yes, I'm not used to seeing them out of their uniform, but I can still recognise their face. Whereas it's like Christie says, oh, you know, like if somebody's got a hat on, then you just never look at their beard. It's the same with The Mysterious Affair at Styles as well. I think there's a moment that is based on disguise in that. But I generally think Mysterious Affair at Styles is just a lower quality of book overall, because it's such an early book. She hadn't got into her stride yet. Then The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is one of my favourite Christie books ever, but the adaptation is absolutely appalling. So the important thing about a detective story is the perspective from which it's told, and a lot of Poirot books are told from the perspective of Hastings, who's like, I think I've talked about this before in a video, but he is like slightly dumber than the reader, but the reader is always going to be slightly dumber than Poirot. So Hastings is like the medium through which we can read it and think, oh, I'm getting this more than he is, even though we're not getting it more than Poirot is. But Hastings doesn't exist in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and it's actually a friend of the murder victim who tells the story. But in this adaptation, they kind of changed it so that it was kind of Poirot telling the story. But you can never tell a detective story well from, or at least you can never tell a Christie, like a Poirot story well from Poirot's perspective, because Poirot is supposed to be getting it, and if it's just like it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So I felt like that adaptation was quite disappointing. But hey, what else has gone on this week? So on Tuesday, I did loads and loads of cooking. So we had loads of veg because Beau had been away for the weekend and I'd been on nights and nobody had done any cooking. So we had loads of food that needed to be cooked. So I did a massive cooking day using this beautiful recipe book here, which is upside down. It's called The Green Roasting Tin by Rukmini Iyer. And this is the only recipe book that I've ever owned that has been worth the money that was spent on it. It was actually a Christmas present from my mum, I believe, or probably from my family, but it will probably have been my mum who picked it out. I made this amazing Creole leek and mushroom tart. This isn't really about reading, but I just wanted to show you how beautiful that tart was. And mine actually came out looking almost as good as that, which normally things come out of the oven and they look nothing like the picture. But they're all like vegetarian roast dishes, so that was quite a nice use of a day, and it means that I've got some really tasty lunches for when I go to work. On my, I had a restful lunch break from that, and I tried to start Death Comes to Pemberley, but my goodness, it's really dull. I've read the first 2 chapters, and I can't remember when I've read such a dull start to a book, so I'm going to be putting that one down for a little while, and maybe going back to Light in August. What else? We also finished, finally, with The Order of the Phoenix. We finished the whole book. The little last chunk that we had left to read. And my opinion still stands. The last couple of chapters are slightly better than a lot of the rest of the book, but this book could be burnt and the whole series would lose absolutely nothing. Dumbledore's Army is quite nice, but it's only about actually 2 chapters in the whole of the length of that book. it needed a very heavy edit, and the actual like meat of the plot around the prophecy, it's really not worth the pages that it's written on. And the ending, I just really don't like the way that the kind of climax of the story unfolds. So I do, like, I have troubles with this book and I have trouble with the pacing, but I do see where it sits in the series, because there's kind of like this symmetry where, major Harry Potter spoilers, by the way, where in the first book, Harry saves the Philosopher's Stone, so he basically saves like life itself. Then he saves Ginny Weasley, doesn't he? And then he saves Sirius Black. And then moving on to the second half of the series, he fails to save Cedric. In the fifth book, he fails to save Sirius, and in the sixth book, he fails to save Dumbledore. So you get this kind of like building up of him as like a hero who is able to deal with things, and then the kind of the bringing of that down where everything starts to go wrong, and then at the end, obviously there's the end. So I kind of see the point of why somebody had to die and why things had to go wrong at the end of this, but it's a bad book. So we watched the movie, and the movie is actually pretty good comparatively. Not great, but better than the book. Then the other thing that we watched was I'm just reading from my notes, the next episode of the Test series. It is Gemma Arterton and Eddie Redmayne in that series. So we watched the episode, I'm not going to say what happened, but the third episode in the series, and it was really emotional, very sad, and I really want to reread Test of the Devils. I've got this beautiful Folio Society edition that was, again, a present from my family. It's got beautiful woodcut pictures in it. So I was hoping to read this. I think this is Alec and Tess. Read from this copy the next time I read it, but I think I might actually listen to the audiobook, because I can listen to that on my way into work if I so choose. Then finally, because I better wrap up because I've got a bus to catch, I also watched, so Tuesday while I was doing my cooking, I watched a ton of booktube videos, and I watched a video from Brian called Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions, where he was recommending this short book about a woman who worked a lot with unaccompanied minors coming into the US from, I think, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So Ros saw that as well, and I think she has got it on the Kindle, so I'm going to hopefully read that at some point soon. And then... stressful things happened yesterday. So I was baking some cakes. One of my colleagues is leaving, so these are the ones that are staying at home. So I've got some little lemon cupcakes that I baked for her, and then I got this email from my short course that I'm going to start in what I thought was a couple of weeks, being like, oh, we'll see you next week. And yeah, it turns out that somehow I got the dates wrong, and I need to be in London next Wednesday, and I also need to be at work next Wednesday. So that is a bit of a headache that I am going to be trying to sort out. But hopefully I will be back next week for another Bookish Breakfast. I hope you have a lovely day and a lovely week, and thank you for joining me. Let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you've got any, thoughts that you wanted to share in the comments. You can do, or you can not do. And now I'm just rambling, so goodbye.